Zodiac Killer. The Zodiac Killer was a serial killer who operated in Northern California, USA, during the late 1960s and early 1970s. The killer's true identity remains unknown, and the case remains one of the most notorious unsolved mysteries in American criminal history. The Zodiac Killer is believed to have killed at least 5 people, and possibly more. The killer communicated with law enforcement and the media through a series of letters and cryptograms, some of which have never been deciphered. The letters contained taunts and threats, and the Zodiac Killer claimed to have killed many more victims than those confirmed by police. Despite an extensive investigation and the circulation of composite sketches based on eyewitness accounts, the Zodiac Killer was never identified or apprehended. The case remains open, and new leads and suspects continue to emerge from time to time. What is the Zodiac Killer's real name? The real name of the Zodiac Killer has never been confirmed or definitively determined, and the killer's true identity remains unknown. The case remains one of the most notorious unsolved mysteries in American criminal history. Over the years, numerous suspects have been proposed and investigated by law enforcement, amateur sleuths, and true crime enthusiasts, but no one has been conclusively linked to the crimes. The Zodiac Killer's habit of wearing a hood or mask during attacks, as well as his use of pseudonyms and ciphers in his letters, have made it extremely difficult for investigators to identify him. Was Gary Francis Post the real Zodiac Killer? There is no credible evidence to suggest that Gary Francis Post was the real Zodiac Killer. In fact, there is no conclusive evidence linking any individual to the crimes committed by the Zodiac Killer. Over the years, many suspects have been proposed and investigated by law enforcement and amateur sleuths, but none have been definitively linked to the crimes. The true identity of the Zodiac Killer remains one of the most notorious unsolved mysteries in American criminal history. Zodiac Killer crimes? The Zodiac Killer is believed to have committed a series of murders in Northern California, USA, during the late 1960s and early 1970s. The exact number of victims is unknown, but the killer is known to have murdered at least 5 people, and possibly more. The victims of the Zodiac Killer included David Arthur Faraday, 17, and Betty Lou Jensen, 16. Shot and killed in a parked car in Benicia, California, on December 20, 1968. Darlene Elizabeth Farron, 22, and Michael Renaud Majot, 19. Shot in a parked car in Vallejo, California, on July 4, 1969. Farron died from her injuries, while Majot survived. Cecilia Ann Shepard, 22, and Brian Calvin Hartnell, 20. Stabbed while picnicking at Lake Berryessa in Napa County, California, on September 27, 1969. Hartnell survived his injuries, but Shepard died 2 days later. Paul Lee Stein, 29, shot and killed while driving his taxi in San Francisco on October 11, 1969. The Zodiac Killer claimed responsibility for these and other murders in a series of letters sent to local newspapers and law enforcement agencies. The killer also sent cryptograms and other clues to taunt investigators and the public. Despite an extensive investigation and numerous suspects, the true identity of the Zodiac Killer has never been conclusively determined or confirmed. Zodiac Killer modus operandi. The Zodiac Killer had a distinctive modus operandi, MO, that included several key elements. First, the killer targeted couples parked in cars or in other secluded locations, usually at night. The Zodiac would approach the victim's car and open fire on them with a gun. In some cases, he would also stab his victims with a knife. Second, the Zodiac often wore a hood or a mask to conceal his identity. He would also send letters to local newspapers and law enforcement agencies in which he claimed responsibility for the murders, taunted investigators and the public, and provided clues to his identity. Third, the Zodiac used cryptograms and other coded messages to communicate with the media and law enforcement. Although some of the codes were solved, others remain unsolved to this day. Fourth, the Zodiac was known for his attention-seeking behavior, including his habit of calling into radio talk shows to discuss the murders and his desire for public attention and notoriety. Despite an extensive investigation and many suspects, the true identity of the Zodiac Killer remains unknown. Anyone survived from the Zodiac killer? Yes, there were survivors of the Zodiac killer's attacks. 2 of his victims survived their attacks, but tragically, others were killed. In the attack at Lake Berryessa on September 27, 1969, the Zodiac killer stabbed Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, who were picnicking near the lake. Hartnell survived the attack, but Shepard died 2 days later in a hospital. In the attack on July 4, 1969, the Zodiac shot Darlene Ferrin and Michael Mageau in a parked car in Vallejo, California. Ferrin died from her injuries, but Mageau survived despite being shot several times. He was able to provide a description of the attacker to the police and helped create one of the few sketches of the Zodiac killer. These survivors provided valuable information to law enforcement about the Zodiac killer's appearance and behavior, but despite their testimony and the efforts of investigators, the killer was never definitively identified or caught. How does the Zodiac killer get caught? The Zodiac killer was never caught or identified, and the case remains unsolved to this day. Despite an extensive investigation by law enforcement and the efforts of amateur investigators and researchers, the true identity of the Zodiac killer has never been conclusively determined. There have been many suspects in the case over the years, but no one has been definitively linked to the crimes. The lack of a definitive identification has been attributed to the killer's careful planning and use of disguises, as well as the fact that he destroyed most of the physical evidence related to his crimes. The case remains open and active, and law enforcement agencies continue to receive tips and information about possible suspects. However, without new evidence or a confession, it is unlikely that the true identity of the Zodiac killer will ever be definitively established. How does the Zodiac killer case ended? The Zodiac killer case remains open and unsolved to this day, and there has been no official ending or resolution to the case. Despite an extensive investigation and the efforts of many law enforcement agencies and amateur investigators, the true identity of the Zodiac killer has never been conclusively determined. The case continues to generate public interest and fascination, and there have been many theories and speculations about the killer's identity over the years. However, without new evidence or a confession, it is unlikely that the case will ever be definitively solved. In recent years, advances in DNA technology have led to renewed efforts to solve the case. In 2018, investigators used DNA evidence to create a composite sketch of the Zodiac killer, and there have been ongoing efforts to use familial DNA testing to identify the killer or his relatives. However, as of now, no definitive breakthroughs have been made in the case.